We talk about narratives all the time and the power of stories. What's important to you? What can we do on campus to bring some of those narratives to the forefront? Because there's no right or wrong way to be a student. And that's really true with any of this work that we're talking about. These dominant narratives around whiteness or male dominated, or the heterosexual experience, or the neurotypical or able-bodied. This work is about that empathy and awareness for other stories and other needs that people have.
Hey everyone, it's Hildy, and this is the Creating the Future podcast. I'm glad you've joined us here today. This is a place for us to explore what really creates social change. What will actually create the healthy, joyful future we all want to live in? This is a special podcast episode today as I get to welcome two friends and colleagues at Creating the Future, Jackie Bradley and Madeline DeMarco. Jackie and Madeline are organizers, facilitators, connectors, and planners. Jackie currently serves in that role at the Lenawee Community Mental Health Authority in rural Southeast Michigan, leading their planning and outreach efforts. And Madeline is currently applying her skills, promoting student health at the University of Michigan. Jackie and Madeline have been an active part of Creating the Future's work over the past few years, sharing their skills, their talents, and their wisdom with our teams and our communities here. And no matter the setting, their insights always inspire us. And so it is my joy to welcome Jackie Bradley and Madeline DeMarco to the podcast today. Welcome, Jackie and Madeline, to the podcast. This is going to be fun. I'm so glad you guys are here.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Would you share a little bit with our listeners, just each of you, what is it in your life that led you to be passionate about social justice? Because both of you are so passionate about social justice. What is it in your life that led to that? Whichever of you want to start, go ahead.
Sure, yeah, I would be happy to start. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about this one because it feels often like such an imperative in my life to just kind of do it and to live social change. So I was really trying to think back and pinpoint. And what I came up with was that growing up, I often felt very isolated. Grew up in a rural community, so there was the literal isolation of a small town, and then the lack of infrastructure and resources that go with that. But then my family was also very isolated within that. So we moved to the Midwest from Colorado when I was young, and we knew no one here, no family anywhere near us within 1,000 miles. And we never really developed a support structure. I don't remember my parents ever making friends in the whole time we've lived here. I never really had friends over myself. So we stayed a very isolated family unit, even within our community. And then even within the family, I often felt very isolated myself. I'm the youngest of my siblings. My parents' marriage was not a particularly happy one while it was happening. So I didn't have a lot of meaningful connections growing up. But of course, that's an important part of, I think, any life. And so I really filled that void with stories. I loved to read, I loved to write and act and music and all of those things, and kind of filled that lack of real tangible connections with connections to people I would never meet, people who maybe didn't even exist in the case of fiction stories. And I think that built in me a very deep and broad empathy for people who were different than me. And that out of that kind of empathy came that real imperative for social change, in that I don't need to have ever met a person or know them or know anything about them to want them to be able to live a good life that is meaningful to them. And that is kind of the thing that has always driven me in that is that I don't think I can look around at the world around me and say that that's happening for a lot of people. And so it is necessary for me to try and work for and with and beside all of those people to try to make that a reality.
How did that manifest into your work life? How did that come to where you are now?
So in my current position, I do a lot of community organizing and coalition building. And again, in a rural community, I circled actually right back around and I'm in a different rural community now, despite I think like a lot of bright young rural kids desperately trying to leave the one I was raised in. But I think it allows me to speak to people in a way that they can feel heard, which allows them to participate in the process. And also recognize the humanity and dignity of people even when I don't agree with them, which happens a lot because my local communities are pretty conservative.
Sure.
And so how do we speak the language that will resonate with them and also hear and really hear the language that they are speaking? Because oftentimes behind the things that we don't agree with are some things that we do of I want to feel like I belong, I want to feel like I am understood, I want to have my needs met. And I don't always agree with the way people are choosing to go about those things. But if we can kind of get past that, then maybe we can work together on some of those things.
Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Madeline, you're up.
Wow, +1 to all of that. I gotta follow. I should have known when I deferred to Jackie that that's what's going to happen.
You knew.
But how fortunate am I to like call her a mentor in this space? So, what led me to be passionate about social justice? I really put the origins of that in the beginning of my career and public health. My background is public health. And I think there's really a connection there with this idea of whiteness. I know this is a podcast, right? So folks can't see, but I identify as a white woman, right? And growing up in a predominantly white community, there was this assumption that I held that everybody was just like me. Obviously, I knew that people were different, like in the broader context of the world, but it was like, yeah, people are different, but like realistically, we're all the same, right? It's not right here, to the point where when I was small, I even assumed that every married couple called each other John and Lisa because that's what my parents called each other. And so there was just this idea, right, that everything was always going to be about me, for me, because I held all of these dominant identities and I didn't even really need to think about it. And I've really been doing a lot of reflecting lately in this idea that there's really a silence there in those assumptions around like, oh, well, we don't have any problems with race in our community because it's mostly white people. So there aren't opportunities for those sorts of problems to erupt. But that silence is really complicitness in that system, right? Where just because we're not actively engaging in harm, like hand to hand combat with people of our race, doesn't mean that we're not thinking thoughts or reading newspaper headlines or otherwise like consuming contexts and content and messages around these topics in harmful ways. I think about creating the future in a lot of ways where that absence of a negative doesn't necessarily equal a positive. It's just zero, which is not, we can do better than that. And so I kind of carried that with me all through my career, I guess, in education, where I always wanted to be a doctor. It was kind of the only thing that I remember wanting to be growing up. And I went to undergrad anticipating that. I did pre-med classes. I took the MCAT. I applied to med school. I interviewed for med schools, even got into med school. And at the same time was taking just kind of like an intro to public health class. And realistically ended up throwing all of that away. I found something that was much more in line with my values, of this idea of being able to help people, which is what really was calling me to medicine, but to be able to do that before the harm even occurs, to help prevent people from getting sick in the first place, and to do that on a population level scale. And in order to do that, we need to be able to address the needs of people. And there's this idea that we all have different needs. We all need different things to be well based on where we are and who we are and the choices that we make and the hands that we are given that we didn't choose to receive. And so this idea of like assumptions no longer was serving me. I also was surrounded by folks that felt really strongly about social justice. I went to a liberal arts college, a big university in a pretty liberal town, and there were always people that were doing that work. And so it was kind of like, okay, the position has been filled, like these things are being done. I don't need to worry about it. Like I can spend my time doing other things. And then I left that environment and went to work with Jackie actually in the complete opposite. She mentioned that conservative, small, rural community. And this coincided with the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. And looking around, I was like, whoa, who's doing something about this? Aren't people going to do stuff about this? And of course, there are people in that community doing things, right? That's part of some of like the biases and assumptions that I held in the circles that I was moving. But it was kind of the first time where I was like, whoa, if I want things to be different, if I want these changes to occur, then I need to start stepping up and doing some of those things. And that carries with me in my role today. I still work in public health, and again, with all of the everything going on in the world, it's like I, at the end of the day, need to be able to respond to the different needs of different people. And that's how I define social justice, right? It's built into the values of public health and the work that I do.
What incredible stories. And we all come from those places of the assumptions that we carry inside of us and the way we look at the world. And we don't realize how much that impacts on everything that we do, that our thinking creates our actions. When you guys, I know that you have worked together on social change efforts. I know that you've worked separately. When you see change happening, it could be small change, it could be big change, it could be observations about the world, and it could be observations about what you see in a small rural community. What do you see happening when you see change happening? What do you see as some of the factors that lead to change?
I went first last time, Madeline. Would you like this
I was
this
gonna say,
opportunity?
we're gonna be playing chicken with the unmute the whole time. um Yeah. So when I see change, I see two things primarily. And I think the first one is this idea of trust, and the other one is around values and living into our values, this idea of values and action. Thanks to Jackie, realistically, I come from a trauma informed background. And I'm sure, Hilda, you can relate too, since so much of creating the future is built around this brain science, around the importance of operating from a settled nervous system. And that only happens when we trust one another or in a place where we feel safe, that we can truly kind of unlock that highest potential and that creative parts of ourselves. Also, it's just so much more like joyful, like how much more joyful to be working from a place of trust. It takes too much energy to be angry and like assume the worst about things. There are too many other things to like be upset about, but that's conversation for another day, maybe. And so we could talk, I guess, all day about trust, but trust stands out to me. And like I said, this idea of living into our values. I do a lot of behavior change work, particularly with college students and their behaviors around and their relationships with alcohol and other drugs. And a lot of that work is also based in the tenets of motivational interviewing, which is saying that most of the time when people, students, anybody is making a change, that idea of change, that seed of change is coming from an internal place, that those ideas have to come from us. We know that education and telling people what to do and blame and shame and punishment don't change behaviors, especially working with 18-year-olds. I'm not that old, but I'm not that young either. So students don't really care what I have to say in the long run, but they do care what their peers have to say, and they care what they have to say and what's coming from them. And so we do a lot of activities and work getting students to reflect on their values and their behaviors and how those things may or may not be in alignment with each other. And it's really when there is a mismatch between those things, when students get the opportunity to say, oh, I'm behaving in XYZ, but I'm saying that I'm valuing the complete opposite of that, that we actually see those seeds for change start to be planted. And it's way more powerful than anything that I can say or do or information that I can provide to students. So that's like the short version of what I would say. I'm curious what Jackie has to say.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. And I think part of what I heard and what you were saying is also what I was thinking of, this importance of relationships
Mm-hmm.
in change, because change is really hard to do all by yourself. And I know it can be for anything. If you want to exercise more, saying, well, you and a friend are going to meet up and go for a walk. I'm a lot more likely to do that if I have to tell my friend I'm not going to go today because I'm sleepy, than if I just am going by myself and I'm not accountable to anyone but myself, because that relationship is now tied up into that change behavior. And for that relationship to exist, we need all those things that you were talking about, Madeline, of trust and, you know, all of these psychological safety aspects of, is my nervous system settled in such a way that I can engage in a relationship with you and that I feel safe with you to go on this change journey. And you also mentioned, Madeline, how important kind of a peer perspective is of, yeah, they might not care what you have to say. I know they don't care what I have to say, that's for sure. But they care what each other are saying, what the others are saying, and what they're thinking, and how that is really informing how we create our values as the people around us, and the kinds of conversations we can engage in with them, and the perspectives they're able to bring to our own opinions and our own behaviors.
What have you guys seen in terms of that peer influence? That's really fascinating to me. And it could be, the way I'm thinking about it, so much of what you talked about early on, Jackie, when you were talking about your own story about feeling heard, feeling seen, so much of that is part of feeling safe, is part of feeling trust. And it feels like there's something there in terms of that's what peers do with each other, where sometimes we don't feel seen and heard with somebody who is, it could be of a different age, of a different race, of a different whatever. We don't feel seen or heard. But there's something I would love to know more, dive a little bit deeper into what you've seen in terms of those peer relationships. Could be in community, it could be in students.
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out to me is particularly around some of the diversity and equity work that both Madeline and I have engaged in. And she mentioned she identifies as a white woman. I do as well, since, as she mentioned, this is an audio podcast, so no one can see us. So the kinds of conversations that I can have with the folks in my predominantly white conservative community are different as a white woman. And so how can I approach with them those ideas of racial equity and justice and all of those kinds of things in a way that a person of color might not be heard if they were saying the exact same thing.
Sure.
And I think that can be complicated in how are we also holding space for those voices and passing the mic when we can and it's appropriate to do so, but also not always expecting others to do the work, and kind of holding the space that we need to hold and holding our own people to
Right.
account and doing what we can on that end.
That's such a big part of anti-racism work. Such a huge part, that the folks that are responsible for racism are not the people of color. The folks that are responsible for racism is white folks. And having those conversations among other white folks is what's really, really powerful. Have you seen any of this in the work that you're doing with students, Madeline? Peer work with each other?
We talk about narratives all the time and the power of stories and the dominant narratives that students hear on campus and what might be below the surface that actually is more representative of students' experience and what we can do to bring that to the surface. And a lot of that work is done most effectively with the peer education model. Again, students will respond better to other students. So the more that we can get students leading the conversations in these spaces. I do a lot of work around well-being, right? So if you think about like little wellness ambassadors or things like that, where students are actually being equipped to do this work rather than a professional staff person coming in, an adult person that has all these years of experience, et cetera, et cetera. And so it connects absolutely to when we think about really any concept related to well-being or belonging, or I happen to focus a lot of my work around substance use, so alcohol and other drugs, but also relationships too, where students come in and have a certain expectation about what the college experience is going to be or what it means to be a successful student that they hear from their peers, that they see in movies and TV or on social media. I was reading a story of someone who was sending their first kid to college and they were going to do like a college movie marathon to celebrate. And they got like 3 movies in and they're like, "Oh, we actually have to stop this because these are all about like wild parties and like insane substance use and all of these things." And we know that there are thousands of students on my campus and any campus that choose not to drink for a variety of reasons, right? And those stories aren't being heard. That might not be the dominant narrative that students are receiving. And so how are they adjusting their behavior to fit in or to cope with what it means to feel like you're not fitting in or to find belonging and community? And so that's really a lot of the work that we do rather than didactic education around substance use or having safer sex or getting better sleep is what are your values? Like, what do you want to get out of this experience? What's important to you? And how can we make space for that? What can we do on campus to bring some of those narratives to the forefront and tell more than one story on campus? Because there's no right or wrong way to be a student. And that's really true with any of this work that we're talking about. DEI, I mean, it goes back to assumptions, right? These dominant narratives around whiteness or male dominated or the heterosexual experience or the neurotypical or able body, like that's true for all of these. This work is about that empathy and awareness for other stories and other needs that people have.
As you always do, you've got my brain exploding. I wrote down about 17 different things I want to follow up with. So it's a good thing we've got 12 hours for this podcast.
There will be an intermission. It'll be
go get some food, make some dinner. I had never really thought about the power of narrative when we so often hear the phrase representation matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never really thought about the power of narrative in that in a college environment, you're right. Everything we see is about girls gone wild, is all of the crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right that, first of all, that's not for most people, but you don't feel normal. We talk so much in catalytic thinking and creating the future about normalizing for people. I can't tell you the number of people in my career in nonprofits that have called to tell me how horrible their board is when they tell me what's going on. And I say, yep, it's you and pretty much every other board. And I can hear their shoulders relax on the phone because they think they're the only ones. And it never occurred to me that link between representation mattering and the stories are the representation. It's huge.
Yeah, it's true for the policy and like the system side of it too, of education being built on a white patriarchal capitalist we could go on and on and on with all the other isms, right? But society. And so how does that leave people behind or feeling like they don't have a path to be successful when there's a good, bad, the written word, supremacy, like all of these binaries in education. And so it's also why I like to lead with my story around, like, I thought I was going to go to med school and threw that out the window because it models another way for students to think about what success looks like and to challenge these ideas around career, and that you have to have it all figured out, and it means sticking to a plan that you've had from day one. It's built into so much of the work.
Yeah. I always appreciate the stories that both of you bring to the work that we are all doing, because it is that link between my story and our story. Until we can be vulnerable enough to tell our story, my story, that's what builds that trust that you're talking about. That's what builds that feeling safe. Jackie, in the work that you're doing, what are you seeing in that realm? Because you're doing so much work directly in community.
Yeah, I think now is a challenging time for that work, especially when we talk about feeling safe. So we do a lot of work around how can we try and build some of that safety as a group, but I think a lot of people are walking in without the internal safety. And that can be very challenging for people to recognize and be prepared to accept that kind of vulnerability that comes with taking that deep breath, letting the nervous system settle when we're so tightly wound. That can be very, very scary. And I think I'm seeing a lot of that right now, frankly, is there is so much coming at people from so many different directions that if they let their walls down for a second, it will crumble.
Mm.
And so they don't. I'm seeing a lot of challenges in our groups right now because people.
And this is as part of a mental health authority, right?
Yes, yes. So
Yeah,
I work for a public behavioral health
right,
system, and in that work with a lot of kind of coalitions across the community on a variety of issues, including mental health.
right.
And so I am often kind of coming in as the resident expert of, well, how do we establish psychological safety and respond to group trauma and institute some of those trauma-informed practices? And I get a lot of pushback right now because that can be very scary. And it's all the more important to do that. So certainly I don't let people's pushback stop me, but perhaps they're a little less receptive to it than they've been at other times when I've been doing this work because so much of the world feels unsafe. What does it mean for us to try to establish a little tiny space of safety within all of that scary stuff that's happening?
Yeah. So much of what both of you are talking about is really at the core of community organizing. Do you see yourselves as organizers?
Sometimes.
I really struggle with labels of things. I don't know. We could probably unpack this in, like, I don't know, my caretaker-ness. But like, I have a hard time identifying with like I am a blank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is so interesting to me how we have these labels. And one of the ones that has always fascinated me is artist. I know some of the most creative people who create the most beautiful art. And if I ask them, do you see yourself as an artist? The answer is absolutely not. And so we have these labels that I can see in that person. They're a phenomenal artist. I can see in the work that both of you do that you're phenomenal community organizers. We don't see ourselves in those roles. And they are labels. They are labels, but they're labels that come with stories and assumptions and all of that other stuff.
I was talking to someone the other day. I do a lot of mentoring with current students, and someone had reached out to me with a question that was essentially along the lines of like, do you like networking? Like, how do you do networking? Like, how relevant is networking once you get your job? Like, do you still need to network once you have a job? And my initial reaction was like, no, I hate networking, because there's like this internal resistance in me to the like transactional commodities based approach to the term networking. And then I thought about it and I was like, actually, you love networking, but you reframe it to yourself as relationship building. And you love getting to meet other people and talking to other people and getting to know them and their values and their stories. And there was a little bit of like sorrow in me of hearing the students question around how relevant is networking when you're still in your job, because I heard that of how relevant are relationships like once
Mm.
you've achieved something. And I just was like, "Oh, sweetie, like we do this work together. We need each other to do this work. Relationships will always be important, whether you're professional, retired, whatever you're doing." And it just made me think about all of the individual narratives that go around. And I don't know how to end that in a wise way, but it really stuck to me.
Yeah, it was wise all along. I think you're good. I think you're good. Jackie, I'm recalling some of the stories that you've shared about doing planning work within your organization and the communications that are needed within that, and some of the pushback that you would get, and navigating that. We always think of this relationship building when it comes to social change as an out there thing, out with those people out in the community. You've had to do an awful lot of change work within your organization. What have you noticed there?
A lot of the same challenges, truthfully. I mean, people are people regardless of where you find them. And I think I don't know, maybe Madeline's point is just really resonating with me right now, but a lot of it has come down to relationships. So I took over my organization's kind of strategic planning process 3 or 4 years ago. And prior to that, we had always used an outside consultant who came in, they did a little retreat, they gave us a PDF that sat on a shelf somewhere for 3 years until we brought them back in later. And so I created this whole proposal that was based very, very strongly on catalytic thinking, and took it to my supervisor, who happens to be our executive director. And she really put a lot of faith and trust in me to give it a shot. Let's see what happens. And I was in a number of conversations where there was pushback from other leaders in our organization to say, this isn't how we do this.
Mhm.
And she really stood by me to say, Jackie knows what she's doing. She's put a lot of thought and research into this. She's drawing on a research-based model. Let's give it a shot. And through kind of that trust and relationship of that relationship, was able to step out and build that trust with the other leaders who needed to at least have some level of buy-in to, participate and go through this process with me that I was helping to facilitate. And it's still not 100%. There are some people at the organization who still would absolutely rather we go back to root cause analyses and the A3 sheet and all of the corporate performance improvement, strategic planning sort of models that we were based very heavily on before. And there are others who got it. They are sold, baby. We are making some really cool big changes in our committees. So we're a non-governmental entity, but we are very highly regulated by the government as a mental health provider, and Medicaid mental health provider. And so we have about 150 different policies. And out of our strategic plan came a group who said, this is too much. They don't make sense. They don't reflect the work that we're doing. We're going to go through, audit every single one of these policies and make sure they make sense and are meaningful to our work. And they're
Wow.
doing it. And like,
Wow.
holy cow.
Wow.
I mean, it's an insane amount of work. That group has been meeting every 2 weeks for the past 2.5 years, and they are going, and they are still going. And we recently had a meeting to say, we're coming up on the end of 3 years. Do we want to wrap up the strategic plan as at 3 years like we had kind of planned? or do we want to extend it to a 5-year to kind of see where we're at? And everyone was like, no, we're going. This work is happening. It's happening fast, relatively fast. 2 years doesn't seem like it, but it is. And it's happening easy. It's just going. And so everyone was on board with extending it for another 2 years to let's really see these projects through and see what can happen in that amount of time.
I mean, first of all, whoa. I mean, like, I wish folks could see Madeline's face just lighting up watching you and listening. I know in some of our past conversations that we've had and with other groups that you all have been part of, that you have talked about having to step back and show the folks within the organization, I know it doesn't feel like it, but look at how much we've accomplished. And this story is just such a huge part of it. I'm guessing, and this is assumptions on my part, so I'll do it as a question instead. Are folks noticing a difference in the policies? Are they noticing that stuff is actually making more sense?
Yeah, I really think so. The first step of that was we have like a shared space where all of our policies just lived in like Word documents. And that wasn't working for people. We had a lot of people out in the field working from home, different sort of working arrangements. They can't access that if they're not plugged in at the office space.
Right.
So we said, okay, let's get an online policy platform. Did that, right? And it's on every computer, every iPad. Everyone can access every single policy we have whenever they need it. And now we're working on kind of actually revising the content of what policies are in there and getting procedures in place where we needed procedures, where before it was just, well, everyone knows this is how we do things. Because, for a long time, everyone did know that that's
Right.
how things were done, but that's not really the case anymore. And so I think it has felt really meaningful to the people involved. I think the people who were not involved have really seen a shift in what these policies are and what they mean, and how they influence the work that is really being done, which ultimately is the point of a policy anyway.
Right.
But sometimes there is a disconnect there, I'll say.
It's so interesting. I'm thinking about when we talk in the language of catalytic thinking and we talk about aiming for what good would look like and then backcasting the conditions that need to be in place for that. One of the conditions that obviously needs to be in place for a policy manual or a set of policies to be applicable to people is that they can get to them, that they can read them, that they can know what they are. It is always so interesting to me that as we walk our way backwards from that big, audacious goal of whatever it is, and the first precursor to that is usually something big as well. People need to have access to information, let's say. Okay, well, that seems big also. And we start walking backwards and it comes back down to these small steps that we can take, which are the first dominoes that lay into place. Those don't feel strategic. They feel massively, most of the time people say, well, that's simple. We can get that done in 10 minutes. Why haven't we done that before? We can just get a platform that makes sense. Oh, wow. Think about that. And what happens is those things so quickly feel normal that we forget that they weren't there. And I love the way that you've talked in other groups about stopping for a moment to let people know this is where we were when we started. And look at how far we've come, even though these feel like little steps. Sometimes it just feels so, well, duh, that's always been like that. No, 2 years ago, it wasn't.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I often have to say to people is, we made that decision. We can change it, right? Because I think so many of our things feel so set in stone and sent from on high that this is just the way it is because it has to be that way. And no, it's that way because someone made that decision 10 years ago because it was the best decision they could make at the time. We can make a different decision literally anytime we want, and we can change this. But that often feels so foreign that we can just make a different decision. And I think that's so rooted in creating the future of we can just ask a different question. We don't have to ask the same questions we've always asked. We can just use a different one and see where that leads us.
Yeah.
And often it leads us somewhere really great
Uh,
and somewhere that feels easy and gets big changes done.
yeah. Yeah. Madeline, I'm curious. Jackie's in a position where she's in a small-ish organization and has that kind of direct influence, has a direct relationship with the CEO of the organization. You are at a university with, I'm going to say, 1 billion employees.
Well, we have about 55,000 students, so you can do the math as to how many people it takes to support that network.
So I'm curious how you see effecting change within the organization when it is so easy in those large organizations to feel like a cog within a wheel. And I'm wondering how you see effecting change that sort of ripples out that way.
It's different, and there are also a lot of similarities, I would say, especially thinking of like I kind of cut my teeth, like I came up in working with Jackie, right? And so, in the same way that they are kind of an independent organization, but still have a lot of directives from the government or these other regulatory bodies, I am part of a smaller unit in a larger bureaucracy that does impact the work that we do. And we still have a pretty large amount of autonomy in the work that we do. I would say, in a huge part to the relationship building that has been done throughout the years looking back before I got to this space, those legacy relationships and things like that, that built a lot of that trust, to keep going back to that and Jackie's point around trust and needing that to make change, where we get invited to the table and can show up in spaces and people might not always make decisions in line with the things that we have to say, but will at least ask for what we have to say. There is still a lot of that and a lot of the, well, what if that wasn't true? Like, how could that be different? And even if it's not, I don't get to write the policies or the employee handbook or things like that. I still get to determine how I show up with my students, with my coworkers, how I design and plan the programs and workshops and things that I am associated with and have some influence over. And so it comes back to relationships and being able to speak to values and using that influence where you can. And it's also hard. I'll acknowledge that too. Like once you're exposed to catalytic thinking, it's like the scales come away from your eyes, and it's really hard to sit in spaces where you're like I have something to say that would make this a lot easier, but I'm not the one running the strategic planning sort of thing. That can also be challenging. And so it is about controlling the controllables for
Mhm.
me and looking for, if not my professional life, that's just one part of my life. I do other work and have other spheres of influences where I can still do social change work and create the future that I want to see. I teach a class for another university, and I pretty much had autonomy to make that whatever I wanted to be. So I could use catalytic thinking and rethink and challenge some of those things in ways where I might not have had that ability in other spaces of my life. So it's similar. It's similar.
We had a webinar the other day where someone was asking, it was about collective enoughness and it was about strength-based approaches to resource development. And somebody was asking, I get it when I can make decisions on my own, but what do you do when you're part of a huge organization? And my answer was very similar to what you're talking about, Madeline, which is that every large organization I've ever seen has small units. And within those small units, we can make a difference. And we're so used to thinking the way Jackie was saying that this is just the way it is. This is just the way it is. And we don't think about what do we have control over? And okay, I may not have control over the whole thing, but if I've got control over this little thing, we talk so often about what we've come to call the when Harry met Sally moments in that old movie where she's faking it in the deli where the woman finally next to her says, I'll have what she's having. That's what we want. When you see success in a small unit, other people are watching. And we forget that other people are watching. And they're asking, how did you get that to work? Because we haven't been able to get that to work.
Well, the tenets of catalytic thinking, I think, really have enabled me to be more creative and unlock some of that potential in situations where I might not have the end all control. If I can't say DEI on a website, that doesn't mean that my personal values have to change. I can be creative in communicating the things that are important to us, whether that's through the imagery and the kinds of representation of people being shown on that website, or that we could keep going with that. And so I think it's also really valuable role modeling when working, at least for me, with other students who this is maybe one of the first times in their life being part of a larger organization that is making decisions often outside of their control. And when they get beaten down by the system, what does it mean to be part of an organization that doesn't always live into the values that we say that we hold? Or how can you work in a space like this? And so being able to have conversations with people around that's really disappointing when that happens. That sucks. That has a lot of impacts on people. And we still hold our values, and we can still encourage each other to live into our values. And what are the spaces where we can empower each other to do that? My job isn't to change the world, right? It's to make a small impact on the people around me and trust that that's going to keep rippling out beyond. So
What do you see in terms of the presence of organizational values? I'll tell you what's prompting my question. I once guest lectured at a university where their values were written in every classroom, and every class related somehow to those values. It was one of the most remarkable things I'd ever seen, where every professor was instructed that part of their job was to relate whatever their subject matter was to those values. Are the values in your organizations as clear? Do people know what the values are? I mean, it's hard to live them if you don't know what they are.
Well, I would say certainly not that clear. That's kind of remarkable, the situation you just described, Hildy. And I think it's a bit inconsistent, truthfully, in most of my experiences, both in my organization and with the different groups, because they also often establish their own kind of internal values, the different coalitions and different things. And I think the trend that I see is we can talk about them, we can kind of agree on them, and then a conflict happens. And suddenly it's not as easy to live by our values as we thought when everything was smooth sailing. And so I think that's the rub of the values is I think we often know the words, but we don't necessarily know what they look like or what they mean really when the rubber hits the road.
yeah, it feels like a yes and I mean that from the perspective of the broader unit that I'm a part of, my student life division, I think is really vocal about their values, or they are posted places. I have a sticker on my water bottle with the values. We just had like a values and action award ceremony for different staff members. They're clearly defined, and values are something that are really important to me, in large thanks to Jackie, who really was instrumental in being like, we're making values based decisions, and we had decision making protocols based on our values, and here's how to handle them when we want to make decisions or in times of conflict. And so I have a high bar, I think, for what it means to live values in action, and I see a resistance to actually specifying like how we make decisions and how we handle conflict. And I think that sometimes that comes from a place of like while we don't really want to admit the power that's held in the space, like the positional power, which can end up causing more harm, right? Because you're operating from a place where there's everyone's equal, everything's fine until all of a sudden you come against one where it's like, no, no questions asked sort of thing. And that actually can cause more confusion for folks in my experience than when we're explicit about how we make decisions and who holds that power and how, those different levels where we can influence decisions that are being made. And there are still little things that give me hope around this work. I was just part of a leadership camp or training for students that was based in values and integrity. So, what does it mean to be a leader that leads with values and integrity? And that was really challenging for some students, I think, who were expecting to come in and get like an Excel spreadsheet of here's what it means to be a good CEO or things like that. And instead, we were talking about things that Jackie alluded to earlier are often viewed as like, touchy feely. We had one student who was like, we're just writing adjectives on a piece of paper. What is this about? And we kept coming back to them over and over again throughout the week. And we would do activities where we would write our values on a piece of paper that we would like wear around our necks, like a little t-shirt. And you would go around the room and see everybody, like read everyone's values and look them in the eye. And then we would do activities that would make it challenging to live into your values. So maybe you're in conflict or there's other motivations or things like that. And you could really see students reflecting on like, what does it mean for me to make this sort of decision when this is the sort of thing that I value? Like if I say I value community and peace and I'm like pushing so and so aside to like get the last whatever like resource, like what does that actually mean? And we had some really good conversations, I think, around integrity, even some of the biases that show up with values. There were students, I'll be honest, that really challenged me with the values that they listed on their shirts. And seeing how even in myself, like I was kind of willing to maybe write those students off or those people off of like they're just not going to get it. Like, what's the point of this? But like Jackie says, we do this work with people that disagree with us all the time. And we need to do this work with people that disagree with us all the time. And actually, what a gift to know those values and the things that motivate us individually so that we can better communicate and speak to each other's needs. We'll be able to get so much more done. And it actually was a super rewarding full circle moment because the student came and reflected at the end and they were like, I had written so many parts of myself off that I didn't think people cared about in order for me to be successful in the world. I thought I had to shut down my playful and creative and fun and relational side of me. And this showed me that that's not true, that people really do care about those things. And I can bring into spaces and be successful. And so that's what gives me hope is that the more we talk about this and instill this in folks, the more they become real and true for us and easier for us to live out.
You're both talking so much about working closely with and including people who disagree with us. I can't tell you the number of times I'm going to be writing an article about this at some point because this one just absolutely got me. I talk so much about radical inclusion that we have to ask who will be affected by what we're talking about and what would it take for them to be part of this decision, if not lead the decision. And the last time I talked about that in a large group, a gentleman came up to me afterwards and he said, radical inclusion just goes so far. I said, okay, I'm open. What? He said, if we're talking about community change, do we want to include like the Hells Angels? And I said, well, let's look at the fact that, first of all, if you're not including, you're excluding. So you're talking about excluding, you're making a decision to exclude some people. So think about it through that lens. And again, words matter. I said, and let's look at what the worst is that could happen. What's the worst that could happen if you include them? And what's the worst that could happen if you don't include them? And if you include them, there's parameters. Okay, so if you're really talking about Hell's Angels and not just using this as an extreme example, maybe you have a no weapons policy. What would it take to include them? What needs to be included? And suddenly he looked at me and he went, I guess people join the Hell's Angels because they want a sense of belonging. And I went, whoa, okay. I don't have to say another word. I'm done here. it was just this beautiful example of everything that you both have been talking about for this time today is we make so many assumptions about people. We make so many assumptions about people. If we don't include the people who disagree with us, we are choosing to exclude them. And they're going to be affected by what we do, no matter whether we include them or not. And I love the examples you're both giving about what it takes to actually include and value and honor people who disagree with us and listen and not only help them to feel heard and seen, but to actually hear and see them. And you're both giving such beautiful examples of that. I hate to say that our time is running out because I could talk to both of you all day and all month. As you think about all that we've talked about, is there anything, one practical thing that you think our listeners can do to make a difference in the world, especially right now with everything that we're all encountering? If you had one practical thing that you would encourage people to do, what would that be?
Can we share like 6 things? No, I'm just kidding.
Sure. I'm not going anywhere.
I think we have 11 more hours to go. So.
Yeah, we're good. We're totally good.
What, you're not going to share one of your 6, Madeline?
Okay, fine. I'll share one. The others will cut. No, just kidding. I think I've been talking about this the whole time, and it is that important to me, which is that we all need to be able to identify our values. If you don't know what your values are, take the time to think about them, write them down, come back to them, think about what they actually mean to you, how you would define them, and how you want to make decisions that are in line with your values, especially when your values are in conflict with one another. And get really good at just introducing yourself as, hi, my name is Madeline. My values are love, trust, joy, connection, blah, 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 blah. And be curious about what other people's values are. That will take you far.
Wow. Jackie.
I think one practical thing that comes to my mind is to find a buddy. It can be really challenging to be the one person in the room who speaks up or who says something. So find that person that you can make eye contact with when you're about to speak up, and they'll back you up. Because there's like a whole, and I wish I could remember whose kind of framework this is, but it's called 2 in a room. That it only takes 2 people in a room to really shift the energy of that room. You need the first person who can speak up and the second person to say, hey, yeah, wait, let's think some more about that. Because it's easy to dismiss that first person. It's a lot harder to dismiss that second person. So find that person in whatever room you're in. Try and find that person because together you can change things.
I know that when the 2 of you were working with each other, that you you were that 2 in the room.
And there were many, many times I made those eyes directly at Madeline, be like, I'm about to go for it, girl. You got to get behind me.
Are you seeing this? No. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for being with us today. This has been such a joy, and I know that we've got 11 hours left, so we will definitely come back for more with Jackie Bradley and Madeline DeMarco. Thank you both for being with us.
Thanks for having
us.
Thank
you so much, Hildy.
I'm so grateful to Jackie and Madeline for sharing their observations and experience with us. Both Madeline and Jackie work within huge systems where it's easy to feel like nothing will ever change. And yet they've both found ways to shift the often staid thinking of those around them to create what is possible. I love their emphasis on working with what you can control. As we find so often, those seemingly small efforts create ripples far beyond that initial spark. Especially during these difficult times when people around the world are dealing with authoritarian influences and tough economic realities, there are things we can control. In my hometown of Tucson, Arizona, our community has been fighting the installation of an Amazon data center. When our local organizing led to our city council unanimously denying Amazon's requests, we had no idea that our small local efforts would make national news, inspiring other communities to fight in their own regions. Small efforts matter. Local efforts matter. And a big part of that is rooted in narrative and representation, as Madeline and Jackie both shared. The power of seeing examples of peer learning and peer experiencing, it brings to mind the promotora model of healthcare, where neighbors are trained to provide health education as trusted sources within their neighborhoods. We don't think about neighbors as peer support groups, but just as Madeline and Jackie shared, people will trust folks who feel like peers. And with the promotora approach, that is just what happens. People feel more comfortable addressing health-related issues that are personal to them, whether that is navigating the healthcare system or getting access to nutritious foods or dealing with sensitive issues like sexual assault. It all comes back to what both Jackie and Madeline noted from the start. Change is more likely to happen when there is trust and relationship. That really is at the heart of all organizing, whether that's community organizing, workplace organizing, or building sweeping movements for change. You can learn more about the work of both Jackie and Madeline at the podcast page for this episode. And if this episode got you thinking, we hope you'll share this podcast with your friends and colleagues and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious about the work we're doing at Creating the Future, we encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. Every week, we share practice exercises to help you put a toe in to shifting your own work simply by changing the questions you ask. You can find that newsletter and a ton of other resources at creatingthefuture.org. Thank you for being with us today and for wanting to create a better future for our world. We'll see you next time here at Creating the Future.